got technician Declan Curran, and you're going to hear quite a lot from Declan today as we work through this day, which marks 10 years of continuous hosting of Mental Health Radio. Take it from us. That's more than 500 shows on psych stuff, the subject that we do best. Over the 10 years, we've interviewed reformed drug addicts, people who have conquered alcohol addiction and smoking habits, people who have turned their lives around from severe mental health issues. One who described her family abuse as guerrilla warfare, and a migrant who lived at Auckland Airport for over 24 hours while trying to find support for her and her children after flying in from South America. We've interviewed university academics, mental health leaders with controversial views, yoga therapists, parents worried sick about the meth addictions of their children, a joyologist who used to have her own program on Planet FM, and leaders of the consumer movement.
Take It From Us has won 9 consecutive awards in the past 9 years in the annual Planet FM Mikey Awards. And later in the show, we'll bring you an interview with the producer of the film Insatiable Moon, which won Take It From Us Runner-Up Award in the community section of the New Zealand Radio Awards in 2013. Take It From Us has been supported by Framework for almost 25 years and celebrates its 25th birthday next year in April 2018.
I want to acknowledge contributors like co-host James King, whose intellect and insight brought fresh new dimensions to our broadcasting, and Declan, our current producer, who is back for a second stint as a passionate volunteer and enthusiastic technician. Also, Planet FM for its support over the years from its production staff, and especially Joe, Willem and Paul, who are the current producers. They're a tower of strength in keeping us on air and supporting our efforts. We've broadcast on Christmas days and New Year's days, and most of all, I want to thank the hundreds of guests who give their time to tell us personal stories that have sometimes made my hair curl. Naively, I came into this job not knowing much about sexual and domestic abuse, even at the ripe old age in my late 50s. But boy, do I know about it now, having interviewed so many guests who sheet home their mental health and drug addiction issues to abuse within their own families. Thanks to everyone who's had a stake in Mental Health Radio, Take It From Us, and a specifically big shout out to our listeners.
Here's what some people have said about this hosting milestone. Congratulations on 10 years. Awesome stuff. Awesome guests with so many opportunities for insight and learnings, and with a lot of laughs along the way. Nice work, Sheldon. 10 years of quality broadcasting is something to be proud of. Congratulations, Shell. What an achievement. And I know you've made a difference in many ways you don't even know. And that came from Russ Skinner, who's a consumer and past guest. A very worthwhile show that has been done wonders for the mental health support throughout Auckland. Congratulations, Sheldon, on 10 years of memories, quality advice and genuine, friendly broadcasting for the community. Here's to another 20. Hey, congrats, Sheldon. 10 years of radio, great years of radio. Keep up the work.
Well, I feel somewhat awkward having those read out, those endorsements, but thanks anyway for the ride. It's a show I feel personally very passionate about, even at my ripe old age. So 10 years of hosting. Let's move on to the broadcast today, which won, Take It From Us, its latest radio award in the New Zealand Radio Awards, and that was in 2013. It's an edited conversation with Mike Riddell, the writer and producer of a movie, The Insatiable Moon. It was described at the time as a Kiwi gem, tackling mental illness and homelessness in a display of cinematic brilliance. Now, in this interview, Mike reveals to me his own challenges with drugs, depression and personal angst, how he has positive techniques to address his moods, and how he addresses his attitudes towards madness and the stigma linked to mental health. Well, here's our award-winning broadcast from 2013. Welcome, Mike. It's a great pleasure to have you in the Take It From Us studio, and thank you for coming up from Cambridge. I know you've got another function to go to.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's good to be on the program.
Yeah, and that function, in fact, is the launch of Johnny Madison's latest CD.
That's right. Johnny's an old friend of mine from way back, and so I take a keen interest in his music, and he was involved in the film we made, so good to be there to support him.
And that film, of course, is Insatiable Moon.
That's right.
So what was Johnny's involvement in that?
Well, Johnny was involved from early on, really. We gave him the official title of Mental Health Advisor, and a long time before we started filming, he met with Rawiri Paratene and helped him with a few clues as to what it's like to be on the inside of the system and what it was like to be a psychiatric patient. And then during the filming, Johnny was on set pretty much every day and was just keeping an eye on things and helping in, the quiet way that Johnny does. And we also had him in a slot in the film, busking down at Ponsonby.
Yeah, I do recall that, actually. Yeah. It was good to see him involved there. That's probably a little bit of an intro, but I did have a question here that might be a strange question to ask, but I did do a bit of research on Google before preparing for the interview, and it says that your dog Baxter is your life coach. What does that say about you, Mike?
I'm sure it says lots of things about me. Baxter, unfortunately, has passed away. Baxter was my spiritual director. He used to teach me how to live life without care and how to love unconditionally and all those sorts of things, and was a very good and faithful guide to me. It probably says a few things about me, that I take my kind of sustenance from unusual sources, and usually looking outside the square to try and reflect on life and its meaning.
Does that help both your mental and physical health?
Absolutely it does, yeah. And, while Baxter was around, it was a great help to my physical health because he demanded a walk every day, and that was a great time to chill out and relax. But also just the way animals are able to slope about and not get too concerned about too many things. That was very helpful to me.
So you've had a journey with a lot of colour and variety and that sort of thing in it. Well, what's it taught you about mental health and madness?
Yeah, I have had an interesting life, I suppose, although, other people say that to me. It just seems like a normal life to me. What's it taught me about mental health and madness? Well, one of the first things that I've come to understand over the long journey is that mental health is a continuum. And it's not that there are sane people and mad people, but that we all find ourselves along that continuum somewhere, and that we often change our position on that continuum. So,
what changes that position, do you think? Is it circumstances, stresses?
Well, I think it can be both internal and external factors. Obviously people suffer grief if they have the death of a loved one, and that sort of drives them into a situation where they don't have the kind of resources they'd normally have. But also there's internal pressures that build up for people. I'm a depressive myself, so I understand the times when you start to slide into a deep hole and you're not sure how you can get yourself out of it. So, I think for everybody there are both internal and external pressures, and, a lot depends on what sort of resources we have to deal with those pressures. Yeah.
If you are a depressive, how do you safeguard against dropping into the dark hole?
Yeah, it's taken me a lifetime to try to figure this out. I try and work with a combined approach in terms of lifestyle stuff, which is the usual sort of exercise and interest and healthy conversations, things that take me out of myself. But I also use chemicals. I take antidepressants, and, it was a long time before I kind of admitted the fact that I needed to have that kind of balancing.
It sounded as though in your younger days you might have used some other chemicals as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I was a big druggie, and particularly psychoactive drugs were a part of my life as I was growing up. Yeah.
And what impact did they have on a tendency to get a bit black?
I think it's a kind of roller coaster, isn't it? Particularly when you get into stuff like speed or P, which is the prevalent one. Nowadays, it gives people incredible highs, and then the fall down again is all the more steep, and you end up in a terrible place. On the other hand, some of the stuff like LSD, it was the awakening of a spiritual dimension. It wasn't always helpful, but it did at least alert me to the fact that there was something else in life just than what confronted me.
So did you learn anything from that sort of period of maybe experimenting a little bit?
Absolutely I did. I mean, that was the beginning of my kind of spiritual quest, I think. When I was going through school, I was doing maths and sciences in hopes of becoming an engineer, and that all got thrown off track completely, and I started exploring other dimensions of life. So.
Did the drugs throw you off, or did you just lose interest in engineering?
It was the experience of the drugs, I think, of realising that, there might be a spiritual dimension to life, and wanting to explore that. Yeah.
You went in pretty serious quest of that spiritual journey, I think.
Yeah, I did for a long time, yeah. In fact, it went on for years, and I ended up in prison in Morocco for drugs, and that wasn't quite sufficient to get me out of that loop, but by the time I got back to New Zealand, it started to shift, and I realised that there were access to some of the things I was seeking without the use of drugs.
And you were a latecomer into your career as a producer and screenwriter and that sort of thing. I mean, has that had an influence, a positive influence on your mental health?
It's a very good question. In some ways it does. In other ways it's terrible. I mean, as a depressive, the worst thing you can do is shut yourself in a room and try and write something, because it's such a frustrating process. And
even more frustrating when you're depressed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you can feel totally worthless. So, it has negative effects as well. I mean, if you get something published or produced, then it's fantastic. It brings your mood up again. But, a lot of artists, writers and artists of various kinds, I think, suffer from depression. It goes with the territory, really.
Do you persist when you are writing, or do you give yourself a break? Because I know that at times when I was involved in journalism, public relations and that sort of thing, and I got depressed and anxious, I mean, it was just such a struggle. And I always felt that it was just putting too much pressure on me.
Yes, it does. And I mean, for me, I'm in the fortunate position of being a full-time writer now, so I can structure my day how I like. I usually do my most intense period of writing in the morning and take it a bit easier in the afternoon, and then my salvation is actually cooking. By the time it gets to the end of the day, I prepare a meal, and it's actually doing some physical work, and I can see what I've ended up with. I've got something to show for my work. And
it's amazing, amazing how good cooking is as a salvation.
Absolutely, it is. Very practical kind of activity.
And very creative too, I think.
Yeah, and enjoyable.
Yeah, and you've got people around who enjoy the product.
Right. That's right. It's a social thing as well. So,
that's great. I mean, Insatiable Moon captured the strength of discrimination in the community. I guess the mentally ill are okay as long as they're not in one's own backyard. Is that the way you still see it?
Yeah, certainly that was what I learned. I mean, in my earlier years I had not much experience of what we called in Ponsonby the psych community, and it changes names every few years depending on what becomes fashionable. But, through a series of coincidences and circumstances, I got to experience that community and to get to know people who were in that world. And it was then that I discovered the kind of level of prejudice and discrimination that was there in the community.
Our show, of course, is about addressing that discrimination and stigma, and it's funded by the Ministry of Health and the Like Minds campaign, which is totally focused on trying to reduce that discrimination. But how did you come to be exposed with what you describe as the psych community?
Well, it started off really running when I was a minister of a church, which was another story in itself, running kind of social activities which we had aimed at second-generation Polynesian young people. So we'd do things like volleyball and supper and everything afterwards. And after a period of time, we realised that the people who were turning up were people from local boarding houses with various mental health struggles. And so we began to just get to know the people. and it was through friendship, basically, that I came into that world. And as you get to know people, you get to know what struggles they're going through, what their needs are, and, you start to identify with them a little bit. And I was in that fortunate position of being able to play both sides of the fence. So I felt that I could assist in some ways with some of the discrimination that people are experiencing.
When you say play both sides of the fence, what does that mean exactly?
Well, it means, I had a good education and I know how the system works for people. I know how to get social and political change operating. And I think those are, useful tools to be able to have under your belt.
It's fair to say, though, that you got into a bit of trouble with the sort of management of the church as a result of courting these psych community.
Yeah, it wasn't the local church, which was very, very supportive and part of the whole friendship movement. Really, it was the hierarchy. I ended up in a position where I was teaching theology. And I was writing books, and I published my first novel, which was The Insatiable Moon. And when it was about to be published, I thought there could be trouble here with the denomination, which is kind of fairly conservative, so I let them have a look at the manuscript. And the end result of that was that they asked me to resign my job, and I ended up sort of having to move out of that position because of the book, The Insatiable Moon.
I see. It was the book rather than the work that you were doing within the church.
Yeah, that's right. The book came out of my experiences working in the church, but it was the book itself which caused the trouble.
Mm.
Yeah.
And in the research and in chatting to you, I understand that in fact you are the founder of what is known as COURT, the Community of Refuge Trust. Was that born in that church?
Absolutely it was, yeah. And again, it came out of our relationship we had with the people who were going through periods of mental illness in our local community, and realising that one of the kind of base factors for people in recovering was housing, because when people got ill, in those days they would come over to Carrington, where we now are recording this, different guys.
Yes.
Yeah. And, they would lose their accommodation, and then by the time they came out of hospital again, they would have to start the whole process over again. Often their possessions had been sold off, they had no accommodation. The frustrating thing, as someone who had a psychiatric history of trying to convince landlords that they're going to be all right, and so we decided that the one practical thing we could do would be to set up an organisation which would work to provide housing, particularly for people who had mental health difficulties.
And unfortunately, that exact scenario that you're talking about and you painted there is still happening today. And I'm trying to help a guy who was co-hosting this radio show at one stage. He's lost a lot of his possessions for whatever reason. He's taken a flat in Kingsland, hasn't quite moved in yet. But there's going to be some challenges there, and, furnishing it and that sort of thing has been a challenge as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's such a tragic story to see people, starting from the very beginning when they've done it many times in their life before. And, So
they were some of the housing realities that encouraged or stimulated the formation of COURT.
Yeah, exactly. At the time, what was then the Housing Corporation had this scheme operating where they'd provide 100% finance to charitable trusts to buy houses at 7% interest. And they were just about to close the scheme down when I discovered it. And so I approached them and they said, well, yeah, you better hurry up if you want to get involved on it. So we set up a charitable trust with undue haste and grabbed a house and got 100% funding for it. And that was the beginning of the trust, really. And, about 2 months later, we had a drainage bill for $7,000, and the trust just about went down the tubes at that point. We were really in a stressful situation.
Right.
Yeah. And nowadays, I'm happy to say, with good management since I've left the place, the trust has millions of dollars worth of housing, which is made available for people.
So it's been a tremendous success story.
It has been, yeah, and mainly because of two things. I think the hard work of the kind of management team and Peter Jeffries, who who's been part of the whole thing from the beginning, and also I think the integration with the church community, which has continued to be an important part of it, just so that there's a kind of community of support for people, that it's not just a social services, so, that involves companionship and friendship and knowing people by name and that sort of thing.
You're with Take It From Us on 104.6 Planet FM.
So we're talking today on Take It From Us, Mental Health Radio, to Mike Riddell, who is the screenwriter, I should say, and producer of the famous movie Insatiable Moon, the book of the same name, and is a prolific writer as well. So the foundations of your book, Insatiable Moon, Mike, were this background that you've given us.
Yeah, it did grow out of the work of the Trust. In those days in Ponsonby, there were a lot of boarding houses around the place, and we got to know the people in the boarding houses. One of the guys in a local boarding house was a real character by the name of Arthur, and he used to come and visit me and try and persuade me that he was the second son of God. Arthur and I developed a really strong friendship. He was a lovely, charismatic guy. Eventually, he died from kidney failure as a result of the long-term medication he'd been on. But I used to think back sometimes when he left the office. I think, gee, what would it be like if he really was the second son of God? You know, and I've been fobbing him off all this time. That was the kind of germ of an idea which stimulated me into fictionalising his life and writing the book, The Insatiable Moon.
So that was your first book?
Well, it was my first fiction book. I've been writing non-fiction stuff for a while, sort of books, general spirituality and such like. But I felt the kind of desire to try my hand at fiction.
So the book and the film were based on a very real personal experience for you?
Absolutely they were, yeah. And I mean, one of the lovely things, tonight I'm going to Johnny Madison's launch, as we've talked about, that the real Arthur's niece is going to be coming along. We've only recently made contact with her, and so it's lovely to have that family connection as well. But Arthur was a very real and wonderful guy. I mean, the film is obviously fictionalised, so that's not his story.
But a lot of people would think that the whole thing was fiction, and probably the idea was fiction, but in fact there was a real person.
Yes, he was.
And
that's right.
Coming to see you as the pastor or the clergyman.
That's right. And he was well known by people who sort of lived and moved around Ponsonby. I mean, Johnny Madison used to play music with him. Arthur would play drums. So, no, he was a big guy, unmistakable, long hair, Maori guy, lovely guy, fluent in te reo.
And you have a scene in Insatiable Moon where he does come to see you for the first time, and you're a little busy writing our sermon.
Yeah, well, I don't want to claim identity with the vicar all that much in that film, but there are certainly some connections there.
Right. So it must have been quite satisfying that it became such a great success.
Oh, it's hugely satisfying. I mean, the whole process was satisfying. We had a wonderful group of cast and crew. We had magic experiences along the way while we're shooting it, and ever since, just to sit with audiences and watch it has been an extremely satisfying process.
Right. And you've had a sort of a spin-off as well, a documentary, 35 minutes or something like that, which is called Lunatic. And I did have the privilege of seeing that. I must say that, and I think I indicated to you, I was a little confused about its purpose. And it seemed like how we made Insatiable Moon type documentary. That you had other more serious reasons to produce that.
Yeah, we started shooting footage for the documentary while we were making the film. It was always our intention to create another resource. One that would be used to highlight stigma and discrimination in the mental health field. So in doing so, we sought funding, and we got funding both from New Zealand and the UK, so we had to make a sort of dual-purpose documentary, which meant it was a bit confused in some ways, and that there was both New Zealand and UK people being interviewed. And the structure we used was to start very much from the film and assume that people had seen the film, and to begin to talk about the story of the real Arthur and his experiences, and use that to build on the experiences of other people who exist in the system, and then to address the issues of stigma. Yeah, so it was really designed for people who know nothing much at all about stigma and psychiatric illness, and but who may have seen the film, and that could be a jumping off point for talking about the issues.
I mean, stigma is quite a difficult thing to describe and to capture, and even though I've been working with like minds on this show for quite some time, I still get a little bit confused if I have to explain it in simple terms. Are you able to do that?
Oh, I don't know. I can make an attempt. I mean, stigma from its etymological roots means a mark that's applied to someone to mark them out from the rest of society, so that they can be ostracised or shunned. Obviously, during the Second World War, Jewish people had to wear yellow stars and such like. There's no physical mark to the same extent with mental illness, but the very title of psychiatric patient or, nutter or whatever trendy word it may be applied does tend to mark people out. And what I think happens with stigma is that people cease to relate to the person that they're confronting and relate instead to the label. And there's a whole lot of misunderstandings and prejudices that go along with that.
You handled that subject on sort of several fronts, I think, in Insatiable Moon by using the documentary, the news documentary.
That's right.
As one level, and then there was the community meeting, I guess, which captured it again, and then there was the reaction to some of the individuals in the street.
That's exactly right. And I mean, it was fascinating to watch. So sometimes we had the actors playing their parts out on the street and getting very suspicious reactions from standers by. There still is a huge amount of stigma associated, I think, with mental health. Some things that have had stigma attached to them in the past, like sexual orientation, I think, are gradually changing their profile in the community, but this is one that I think has still got a long way to go. When I was first encountering this whole world, it was back in the 1980s, and there were some real problems in that area. I mean, Carrington was still going. We were setting up the Housing Trust. There was huge opposition in the community to doing it. I think things have relaxed, and I think like minds like mine have just done a fabulous job, and I think, used a whole variety of different resources to try and engage the public, and I think it's been a really good and positive movement. And, it does take time to change, but attitudes do change. The one comment I would make is that I think most of the changes come at this kind of higher end of functioning, and not so much at the lower end of functioning, where people may be in kind of supervised care homes and have behaviour that marks them out as being considerably different. There's still a long way to go.
So, I mean, your movie clearly focused on those people that you might describe as the lower end of functioning.
Yes.
Did you get any resistance or flack, if you like, from mental health authorities who said, well, these are not going to help our cause?
Not directly, no. We definitely perceived the attitude that, our film might be one that engages people with mental health, but it wasn't kind of quite touching the agenda of some of the agencies that were otherwise supportive of us.
Big gap between sort of John Kerwin, who's diving into a swimming pool, and these guys who are
diving into a rubbish tin. Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. So that is a real factor. I mean, one of the interesting things is that we shot the film at an actual respite care home, supervised care home, and the owner, who was very supportive of what we're doing, took most of the residents away on holiday during the period of the filming. But some of them weren't keen on going on holiday, so they stayed behind, which really was fantastic for the film because the actors were surrounded by people who were sort of acting out a bit. And it kind of gave an air of reality to the whole thing that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Well, I have dropped the occasional client off at that location and very close to Point Erin Pools,
right.
I think. It's still in existence?
It still is, 2 houses there, and fantastically well run, and I think it's just lovely that it's smack bang in the middle of some of the most expensive real estate in Auckland.
You're with Take It From Us on 104.6